I saying that correctly?
It's not too bad, but Steph is good.
Good. Okay, I'll go with Steph. My mush mouth from Louisiana doesn't always.
No. He said it right. Stefanos is great, but don't. It's a tricky one. It's Greek. It's a little complex.
Perfect. Matt's really easy. It's no one has any problem with Matt. So you talk about overcoming fear, and you talk about fear being this kind of driving force in, I think, a lot of people's lives as a thing that holds them back. And so I'd love for you to talk a little bit about fear in relationships and how that leads to intimacy. And is that something that's always been there, or is this something that's continued to kind of grow with the way modern culture has changed?
Yeah, I think we're obviously we're motivated and driven by various aspects of self, biological, psychological, spiritual, emotional, etc. Emotional being somewhat not somewhat, but being biochemical, electrical, and that. We're either pulled towards something where we're inspired, and when we are inspired, there's less space for contraction. There's less space for psychological and emotional fear. There's less space for low self-worth, insecurity, feelings of inadequacy. There's less of a sympathetic nervous system response. There's less hormonal fluctuations of adrenaline and cortisol when we're inspired and pulled towards something. And when we push ourselves towards something, when we're pushed towards something, it's more forceful. There's more of a contracted state. We're more in a sympathetic nervous system response. There's fear that accompanies that, right? And so there's constantly this interchange between psychology and biology that's going on in our bodies, in our beings, right? So we're either, moved by love and we carry a spaciousness within ourselves, or we're moved by fear. So we need to do something in order not to receive the negative consequence. So if I don't go to work, I'm not going to get money, and therefore I won't eat or have the things that I want or keep up with the Joneses or get the car that I like or whatever it may be, right? Even if I don't like my job, I'm going to work, I'm going to do the things, I'm going to give my time, my resources, my energy. I'm going to feel all the feelings of frustrating because I'm driven by fear of not having. I'm driven by fear of lack, right? As an example.
Yeah, not being able to provide for your family. Any other stories you've decided to?
Of course. Yeah.
Now, you see being pushed toward, the thing. Now, are you considering that being an internal or an external push?
Can be both.
Okay. And so
can be both.
I know for me, like the internal push rarely, or I guess at this point for me, is rarely fear driven. And it's like that push toward the unknown. I like, but that's definitely taken a long time to develop.
Well, I was going to go somewhere with that. So let's go into the original question around fear and intimacy and fear in relationships and so forth. So you say the stage of life where you're at now, the season you're in, and what you've moved through, very rarely are you driven, motivated, moved by fear, correct? That's correct, right? You haven't, yeah. So with that said, what has transpired in your life for you to get to that point? Why do you think you're at that point? In the most simplest form or language you could use.
I overcame a really, really dark period. Got injured as an athlete and then had a bunch of knee surgeries and lost a bit of an identity there of who I was, what I could do, those type of things, confidence in my body. And then, which turned into struggle in a relationship and a divorce and those type of things, and to now being on the backside of it after doing a lot of self-awareness work.
There it is. That's it. So the difference between driven by fear or being driven or moved by love or an expansive place is that right there, doing the internal work. Now we have to unpack that. Mm-hmm. We have an opportunity to unpack what does doing the internal work mean, right? And we can do that now. We can. Yes. Yeah, we can begin to unpack what that means. But essentially, in short, it's doing the internal work. It's being aware of yourself. It's being aware of your circle. Awareness is only one part of it. You're obviously taking actions, activating internal ways of being within yourself, new practices, habits, inner child work, self-love work, somatic work, trauma release work. Utilizing somatic tools to move the tension, the trauma, the pain, the fear out of your body, because generally the inhibitions, the insecurities, the pains, the arguments, the conflicts that we experience in our adult lives, in our adult relationships, are really reflections of our childhood experiences, what we experienced growing up during our formative years, our developmental years of understanding self, understanding the world, understanding relationship, how we give and receive love, how we relate to intimacy. Is it safe? Is it unsafe? Are people safe? Is love safe? Our sexuality, all of that is formed during our developmental stages of being, from the ages of really in the womb to 12 years old, 15, 18 years old even. And we develop these ways of being, these coping strategies to deal with difficulty and fear and pain. We develop these coping strategies to deal with loss and abandonment and rejection. And what are our stories? What are our experiences? Were we violently abused by our father, by our mother? Were we sexually abused by people that we trust and love? That impacts and affects how we then see the world and see others, how we enter into relationship. We want to be in relationship because we all crave to be understood and seen and loved and all those things at some level, right? We all want that attention. We all want that respect and reverence. And there's a part of us that's fucking really scared to even go there. So now we're driven by fear. All the things that we do, the nuances of our behavior, whether it's the people pleasing, whether it's the lying, whether it's the avoidance of the hard conversation, whether it's the trying to always gain the upper hand in relationship, whether it's being loud and big and obnoxious to let that person know that you're in control because you fear being out of control. All the ways you show up in relationship are effects and symptoms of what you experienced growing up. And how to remedy that, or how to get into greater mastery of yourself and be more active in your conscious mind to choose what you want to do and who you want to be, is to quote unquote do your inner work. Go on a vision quest, work with a shaman, work with a psychologist, understand your childhood traumas, explore these aspects of self, look at the patterns in your life. Spend time in nature, move and exercise your body, have a healthy constitution. Look at where you're avoiding in your life, where you're overworking, over drinking, overeating, taking too many drugs, numbing out in front of the TV, avoiding the thing that you know that you need to do, not really living a full life and living in regret and waking up every morning and doing, which basically says, I fucking hate my life.
Why do you think so many people can't find a direction for that energy and are just caught?
Because it's too intense to deal with. Okay. Because what happens is when the body experiences, a great question, and it's a simple answer, but a very difficult one to go into. Because I would premise that, I would posit that you, in your own journey that you went through, that you've gone through, that you continue to go through, had to face some demons, correct?
Sure. Yeah. There's no doubt about it.
You had to face some hard times. I would also say one of many reasons, I'm sure, why you became an athlete was to protect yourself, was to prove something, maybe to your father, maybe to someone else, maybe to the world, maybe to yourself. But the discipline and the hardness that you learned in being an athlete actually prepared you indirectly for the journey of facing your demons and the shadow walking that you did, the hero's journey that you went on. Because you had an example, it's parallel. It's like, you work in the oil and gas industry and then you move into the medical industry, let's just say. There's parallels there, right? Like the skill sets that you learned there in management in oil and gas or whatever, there's a parallel and a crossover in other industries as well. It's the same. Like you deal with pain in one area of life, you can learn to deal with pain in another area of life. And so most people just, they don't know how to look at their stuff because they're such in a pattern of years of compounding, of running away from themselves. And the reason why they've done that is because it's too difficult to look at. It's too painful. When we're young and we experience cycles of abuse or patterns of insecurity or an identity of low self-worth or whatever, our bodies are very, very good at saying, I don't want to experience that, so I'm going to compensate. I'll compensate with high grades. I'll compensate with a high sex drive. I'll compensate, sexual promiscuity. I'll compensate with impressing my friends and being violent or being the big man on campus or being the kid that takes all the risks, or I'll compensate with hiding in the world. That becomes a primary pattern. Hiding in your room, not playing with the kids, not wanting to be seen, not wanting to be bullied. Now you hide in other areas of your life, including hiding from yourself, which becomes a pattern.
Now, do you think that's more prevalent now with as much social media and online that we have, that people can essentially retreat into a different reality?
I do. I think there's I think there's keyboard warriors out there that wouldn't do or say what they say if they're in front of a person.
Of course not. But, man, I look at that, right? Like the troll culture. And so that's one of those things as someone, like, I find full accountability in a lot. And I think that's our fault, right? Because naturally, right, we always give attention to the negative comment instead of the 20 positive ones or the, right? And so that one gets more light. And so we've taught people that if you want attention, if you throw this flag up instead of celebrating someone's progress or any of those type of things, if you shit on it, people will pay attention. You're more likely to get a response, positive or negative, and people don't care. People just want a response. They want to be heard in some way.
People are hurting, right? Like our mutual friend George George Bryan said something very interesting to me a number of years ago, and he said, "It's a fucking honor and a privilege for you to be receiving those negative comments. They feel safe enough to troll you, to cry for help. How are you going to respond? What's coming up for you?" And I found that very interesting. I don't forget that. And the other thing that I find interesting as well is what you're saying is that we focus on the one comment out of 100 that's negative and the 99 that are positive, right? And which can be a very fairly accurate. You look at some of the high profile people, let's just say they get 20,000 comments, maybe 1,000 are negative, 19,000 are positive. But I mean, I'm not saying certain people focus on the negative, but we have a propensity to do that. I think about it and I think, we're actually more interested in the shadow than we think. We avoid the shadow, but we're more interested in it than we think. The shadow within ourselves, it plays a role. It's a messenger, right? Like the darkness that we have within ourselves, you can call them demons, you can call it darkness, you can call it the shadow. It plays a role in our identity. It forms part of who we are, but we keep suppressing it. We keep fracturing ourselves. Like take anger, for example, right? Particularly with men have been told that anger is bad. But at the same time, your anger is good, like anger on the football field, right? Anger playing rugby, whatever it may be, like anger in sports, aggression in sports is good. And we reward that. We reward the CEO who's aggressive, right? Yet at the same time, we don't want men to be violent. And so our nervous systems and our minds are confused, number one. But we demonize anger. And anger is an emotion. There's no negative and positive emotions. It's just emotions. Right. We judge and we compartmentalize and we label, right? And that's fine. Like if we were overtly aggressive and autocratic and oppressive and controlling and forceful, that's not a desirable place to be. For most people that are being that person, most people on the receiving end of that's not a desirable place to be. And that's not going to, I think, evolve our species, but there's no negative emotions per se. It's just counterproductive to our evolution, expansion, and growth. But you look at anger, and then you've got and I'll use myself as an example. Like I grew up in violence and volatility and anger, a lot of aggression, a lot of rage from my father, from my mother too, right? And so as a little kid, I compartmentalized and I shut that down and I went into sadness. I didn't want to be angry. I thought anger's bad. So I learned to numb. And so I numbed these parts of myself. Now as a teenager, I couldn't numb anymore. I was so fucking angry, being bullied, my parents, like my family home, and I got really angry. I became a bully a little bit, not a lot, but I became violent. So I started fighting, started showing people how tough I could be. Stop picking on me, right? Yeah. And then as a young man, a young adult, much of the same, but I had this very weird relationship with anger. Try to be all calm, try to be placid, try to take this moral high ground, but I never really connected with my anger. So I was told my anger is bad. And it's not until I started doing really deeper work where I came into deeper communion with my anger. Because up to that point, I was either numbing it out or it was leaking out. And either way, I was hating parts of myself, ignoring parts of myself, and therefore feeling broken and fractured. Now, I wasn't broken and fractured. I'm whole. We're all whole beings, but I felt that way. And so because I felt that way, I felt broken and fractured, I had to compensate. I had to make up for. So not only did I have to compensate for my anger, so I had to do other things in the world that would be good to elevate my status, make more money, have sex with more girls, whatever it may be, cheat on my girlfriend and look cool in front of some of my friends, like all that shit.
Sure.
And not only did I have to compensate, right, I had to start seeing myself differently. So my identity started, my ego started, I started playing with my ego and I felt broken in the world. And I couldn't sustain that. And most men will go through that process, particularly in relationship to anger. And they don't know how to be with their anger. So they can either completely shut it out or it leaks out.
Yeah. There's just I see that a lot, like especially now, where that's considered such a aggressive overtone attack that there's not a great outlet for it. And like I know an older me now at almost 40 compared to me in my 20s, right? Like there's occasionally I run into it where I'll get really frustrated and angry, and I'm mad that I don't know how to flex that muscle as well as I used to anymore. And trying to figure out the right outlet for it that isn't pointed at people I love, as it just being an overflow of me getting rid of some of that energy. It's tricky. It's tricky, but that's further down the road of dealing with anger. But like where you're saying, like in the early, finding out how to deal with that. Now, is that due to so much of that ego is built on your perception of how other people see you instead of how you're actually seeing yourself?
Yeah, well, both. So it's how I see myself, it's how I think people see me, and it's how I think people think that I see myself, if that makes sense.
Yeah, there's a lot of expectation.
There's layers.
Like you're thinking you're basing something on how you think someone else thinks. Yep. It's 2 layers of it.
Yep. And I'm acting in accordance with that because I don't want to be pushed out. And it's a primal thing. It's an evolutionary function of remaining safe. I don't want to be pushed out of the in-group. Right? No, none of us do. None of us do. Whatever in-group we identify with. So in subtle ways, in unconscious ways, we will behave in accordance with not the goal of not being pushed out of the in-group, not rocking the apple cart, because that's our safe haven. And so often what happens is we'll continue to dishonor ourselves and forge an identity that is fake, almost. And what's required, and I still work through this as a man. I'm super self-confident. I'm super self-aware, and I have a high sense of self-worth. Sometimes I slipstream into arrogance as well, and I do my best to check myself and learn from that, and not punish myself for it. But even me still, like I can see myself sometimes behaving in ways that is because I still want to be in the in-group. And I'm also one of those people that just does my own thing too. Like, this is what I'm going to do because and not in a selfish, self-absorbed way, but just honoring, being truthful to myself. But I get caught in that dance as well. Sometimes we all do. We're all susceptible to it. And that's part of the journey. That's part of the opening up our hearts to who we truly are and really making choices that are in alignment with our truth, not someone else's, which can be difficult.
That's for sure. That's for sure. It is like that figuring out your own truth and then trying to stick with that without, adding in expectations that you've put falsely on from other people around you or this idea. I know for me, it took a long time to realize that, that insecurity that you get about going in somewhere and wondering what everyone's going to think of you and this and that. Yeah. At some point you realize everyone feels the exact same way I'm feeling and they're about what everyone else in the room is thinking. And so at some point, fuck it, that's a complete false sense of whatever it is because no one gives a shit. Do your thing. And that's what people notice. People notice confident people that do their thing because they want to be that. And it seems like an obvious thing to tell people to figure out who you are and lean into that. And then it attracts the rest of it. Like you can't circumnavigate that point to go forward, it seems. Now, do you see more of this? I mean, for me, look, I didn't grow up with any of this existential information. My parents weren't talking about it. And I look at my childhood and there's shit in it, but overall was great. But it's great as a comparison to people I know who had really rough childhoods. But that doesn't mean that there isn't trauma in it, right? Like I look at that now with, I mean, do you think that everyone comes out of childhood with trauma?
Yes and no, but let me really clarify that. Number one, we should never
negative trauma is the problem.
Sorry?
Just a negative connotation toward trauma?
Yes. That's part of the issue. Yeah. And I shouldn't say should and never together. I'm just minding my language, right?
Sure,
It's important. It really is important that when we look at trauma, we don't compare. Number one, because trauma is less about the experience and more about how the individual received and interpreted the experience and how they process that in their psychology and in their biology, in their nervous system, and essentially in their sense of self. And so that's really important to note, the comparison piece. Not everyone experiences trauma per se, and there's big T trauma and little t trauma. There's chronic acute trauma or chronic or acute trauma, and then there's chronic and acute trauma. And being locked in a basement for 10 years, being starved by your parents, sexual abuse, chronic physical abuse. Like there's being in war. There's big T trauma that's very overt and very clear. And then there's subtle trauma. There's, unconscious psychological warfare that's not necessarily intended for warfare, but psychological warfare, but it is like your parents gaslighting you coming home and saying, look, mum, I got an A-, and your mum's like, why didn't you get an A+? Just simple as that. And that little things like that happen over a period of time, or your parents comparing you to your siblings, or why can't you be more like Harry? Harry's better. And then all of a sudden you develop this complex and it compounds. And maybe you were just bullied just a little bit or teased just a little bit verbally at school for a week. And that's all you've ever had per se. But wow, has that impacted you? So it's very difficult to compare trauma. And people aren't perfect. Parents aren't perfect. Like I'm just, I don't know. Are you a father? You a parent?
I'm not. No.
Well, I'm about to be. I'm 39. I'm about to be in March.
Congrats, and
thank you, brother. Yeah, thank you, little baby girl. And
good for you, man. Congrats.
Yeah, thank you. And I thought I'd never have children up to probably 4 or 5 years ago. I thought I didn't want children because of my childhood, right? But I'm not perfect. I have a feeling I'm going to be I hope to be an effective, great, loving, father. Look, all the virtues that accompany that, and that I perceive to be a good father, a good parent. But I'm going to make mistakes, but how we repair really matters. My point is most people don't know how to repair from making choices that hurt themselves and hurt other people, and they don't repair in a timely manner because they've never been taught and they don't know how. I've done deeper work on myself. I'm in the space. Like I'm trauma informed. I work with trauma, and I'm still not perfect. Like when we're in our own stuff, we can have all the intelligence in the world, but when our prefrontal cortex shuts off and we start operating from the hindbrain and the primal self, like all that shit goes out the window. So it's a practice, right? It becomes a practice. But my point again in saying that, sorry, it's a long-winded point, is that we're not perfect as humans. So the yes and no, do we all experience trauma? To some degree, yeah, and that's okay. It's part of life. Just like sex is and love is and eating is and, being in different terrains is and climbing mountains and all those things, it's just part of life. And not everyone experiences acute and chronic trauma, though. Not everyone experiences intense trauma, right? And that's a fucking good thing. The society needs more of that. But to some extent, we will experience something that's going to really challenge us. And then how we interpret that during and how we're supported through that when we're children really informs how we turn out as adults.
Sure. And I guess I would almost look at that as just challenging life experiences, vocabulary wise, what I would use trauma, because trauma does have such a negative, but for sure, like we're so definitely shaped by our childhoods. I was talking about it with a friend, and like, I remember growing up and having somebody who's like, their house was a disaster. And like now looking at it as an adult and thinking back, like, oh man, they had some hoarding issues and some just like, I don't know if hoarding or just not picking up, either way. But you don't think everyone's house, like you only know your house, for a long time. That's where the most of your experience is. And especially with our friends who had a similar growing up background, small town, like everyone's houses were pretty much the same until you went into someone's that was different. And now, does he notice how different every other house is compared to his growing up that way? Or like at what point, I guess what I'm getting to is you don't notice how different your thing is compared to other people's. And so if you're trying to compare and be like, oh, our house wasn't as dirty as theirs, that doesn't make your house not dirty. And so when I went through a bunch of chronic pain issues, my knee and hip, I would get a lot of information, or not information, but I would get a lot of messages from people that reached out and they were like, I'm dealing with knee pain, but it's not as bad as yours. And I'm like, yo, that doesn't make your fucking knee not hurt. Like I'm not winning the fucking knee championship, dude. If you have pain that keeps you from doing what you want to do on a daily basis, we have something in common. Right. And so that comparison of trauma and pain is such a really strange hole that we dive into as people to protect ourselves from actually, I don't know if it's protecting from doing the work on ourselves, or is it keeping us from admitting that something needed to get done, which I guess is basically the same thing.
Basically the same thing, that and more as well. And, I would say something interesting. So someone like yourself, I don't want to claim to know you in that way. I'll use myself as an example, right? I'm a very active person. And a lot of my identity is wrapped up in my physical performance. It has been for a very long time, right? Like that, the relationship to that has changed over the years immensely and in a far healthier way. But man, if I'm not fucking moving my body, if I'm not slinging heavy kettlebells, if I'm not doing high volume pull-ups, if I'm not challenging myself, doing quite funky things, like I not that I feel less than, I just don't feel as accomplished, right, as an individual. Again, my relationship to that has changed dramatically. So if, let's just say, I had a chronic injury, and trust me, I've had many of them over the years because I've been pushing my body. I've been exploring my edges physically and mentally and spiritually and emotionally. But let's say I had a chronic injury, right? And let's just say it was a knee, and it really quote unquote stopped me from doing a lot. Right. There's a lot that I could do, but let's not put a positive spin on it. Just look at it for what it is. I would say someone like me, and I'm going to make an assumption, someone like yourself is going to have far more challenges in dealing with that mentally, right? Not to say we can't move through it and we won't use it as a lever and pull that lever to our advantage, but I'm going to struggle a lot more with that than someone that is inactive, doesn't care to exercise and all those things. That's why you can't compare. Now, another thing, maybe just trying to think something, I don't know, call it a childhood thing that comes up for me, because I've done so much of that. I can be more stable in my nervous system, more regulated, more astute, because I've done so much of the core work around it. Someone else that comes up with, is facing a very similar thing, like, dad just not being around because he was physically absent, working so much or whatever, could be deeply traumatic, as they're not reliving that, but moving through it in a way, like, sifting through it and actually clearing out the clutter. So we can't compare the trauma. It's so important to not do that. But to go into what you're saying earlier, yes, we avoid because it's difficult. We avoid because it's unknown, largely. Like that unknown component, man, we very quickly forget. Like, we didn't know how to walk. Oh, okay, we did in our genetic template, it was there, but we had to learn. It was unknown. We didn't know how to speak, but we learned. We didn't know how to do maths, but we learned. We didn't know how to eat, but we learned. But there was a lot of unknown, and we forget that, and we forget how actually, as humans, how really good we are, how proficient we can be with the unknown. But it's just so scary for us. And part of that, not all of it, but to touch on a point you made earlier about society today, it's a world of convenience that we live in that also influences our inability to be more comfortable with the unknown, because we thrive in convenience.
But it's an interesting one, for myself, building a world that the inconveniences are ones that I'm kind of picking as much as possible to I guess, manage those frustrations as they pop up. As you build a world that has less and less of them. Back to the stuff that you're talking about within sex and relationships and working with that as couples. I find all of that super, super fascinating. Is it hasn't been an issue that I've run into, but learning more and more about other people that is something, and that they don't realize this openness or what true sexual chemistry with their partner is and what true intimacy feels like. How do you, I guess, start rectifying that with people? And how do you get them to even admit there's something that needs to be addressed?
Yeah, I often won't. Well, how would I want to answer that question directly? The second question is, if I am working with someone or a couple and they're coming to me for whatever reason, or I'm just having a conversation with people that are open to feedback and they've requested it in some way, shape, or form. It's really just asking quality questions of where they are in their lives and helping them see the forest through the trees, helping them see the patterns that are playing out on repeat that they're actually not aligned with. They don't align with the version of self they consciously want to be. And so you just help people see those patterns. And once they see them, it becomes a little more tangible and accessible for them. And then when it becomes tangible and accessible, then you can start an application of new habits, new tools, new ways of thinking, new embodiment practices. Then you can start to relate differently. Then we can get clearer on, okay, what are your needs? What are your wants? What are your requests? Where do you see your relationship going on? If you could get really real, I create ultimately the first thing to do is create a safe space. Because if the nervous system isn't safe, people, again, they're going to be in retracted fear, physiologically and emotionally. So they're not going to want to explore hey, what do you really want in your relationship? Because what I'm hearing you say is you want sexual variety in very many people. You want a polyamorous relationship, but you don't want to admit it. I'm just giving you an example, right?
Yeah, right.
Well, yeah, and people don't want to admit it because they're scared. And so we're going to get them out of fear to be in their truth so that they're not judged, criticized, humiliated, or rejected for their truth. That doesn't mean the person or their partner can't disagree with them. It means that they can't be judged, critiqued, humiliated, and rejected for their truth. And most people, I would say most people in their lifetime have, if not everyone, has experienced either judgment, either critique, either humiliation, either rejection, either abandonment, right?
For sure, whether externally or internally.
Correct. That's right. So we've got to get them feeling safe enough to really speak their truth. And then from that place, then you can start, can the relationship heal? Yes, great. If so, how? Let's explore that. If not, then maybe the best thing to do is actually not be in the relationship.
Man, I think about how hard that, admitting that truth to yourself and again, finding that safe place, has to be. I mean, I think about, with your own sexual picadillos, I guess, if it will be, your own taste, your own kinks, whatever it is that everyone has, and how hard that is for even people to talk about in a straight relationship, right? That does kind of follow societal norms or whatever you want to have. I can't imagine how hard that has to be, especially thinking 20 years ago for someone to come out, for someone to admit that their truth is following this other path that is completely unaccepted. And so what bravery that takes. And then, I mean, if people can't even do it in their safe, straight relationship, right? A perfect example would be like, I mean, guys that would never, ever allow butt play, right? Because it's gay or it has this taboo or any of these type of things. I guess it still just amazes me, dude, that we have such a taboo wrapped around sex when
We do.
Clearly everything points to this is a thing we like. Whether that's the amount of pornography or how pornography drives technology, like what a driving force and industry that is in sex toys and everything. And guys like you being able to operate as coaches, and how many people are out there trying to help people find more fulfillment in this realm, yet it's still such a taboo subject that we're not even discussing, that most people have either issues with or don't like. Is that just left over from this puritanical bullshit that formed our country, that we're not talking about sex and pleasure in a way that it's pleasure, instead of it having to be this connection with Christ and building a family?
Oh, I think there's many factors that influence that. I'm sure, imperial rule hundreds of years ago has affected that, and the British culture and their prim and proper way of being, and the way that their relationship to sexuality. I'm sure Christianity and other forms of religion have also impacted that as well. I mean, ultimately, sexuality is freedom, man. Sexuality is fucking power, and major institutions, corporations, governments, religious sects have sects, SECTS. They have realized that for millennia. And so they've tried to suppress and control that, because you control the masses and you control the power that can be generated through sexuality, right? Not just with the act of sex. Sorry?
Yeah, back to using fear as the control.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's all it is. That's all the play is, right? But it's not just the act of sex. It's sexual energy and the spiritual aspect of sexuality as well, which I'm still discovering. I think we I'm sure there are masters out there. I definitely don't consider myself a master. I feel I'm a novice in this space, and I'm sure there are masters out there, and even the masters would say there's an infinite realm of discovery in this space, right? And there are many charlatans out there as well. Many charlatans. Man, I could tell you some fucking stories.
Yeah, but that's going to. I mean, look, in my world of strength and performance, like we have just as many. I mean, there's no. Sure. If people are willing to be led, there's someone out there willing to mislead them.
I love that. I fucking love what you just said. I mean, it's so true.
The same deal as, look, as long as things are competed, someone's cheating.
Yeah.
And that's just the way it is. It just takes you to develop enough of a filter to understand bullshit.
Yeah. But you got to, the more you connect with your own bullshit, the more you appreciate and accept your own bullshit, the more street smart you're going to be. Simple as that.
Yeah, absolutely. You just get better at sniffing it out. Man, the sexuality thing, because it's been it's been very important for me. I enjoy that side of my relationship. I love that act, that connection with my partner, that it's always been very, very important to me. It seems strange that I guess that it isn't to some people, and that people are completely indifferent toward that energy. And I'm sure you deal with couples that have a complete imbalance in those type of things, whereas one grows through a more asexual chapter of their life, and then one, accelerates to something different. I definitely ran into that a little bit in my previous relationship, where I was interested in other things. And I don't know if that was, I knew that where I was headed isn't where I wanted to go. And so it was time to start exploring anything else that wasn't that direction, if that makes sense. But, now I know that it was by far something more I needed to sort out than it had anything to do with inadequacies of my partner. And at the time, I didn't see it that way.
Yeah. Often we won't, particularly with sexuality. It's such a personal thing, and it's such a sensitive topic for us as well, because and I mean, just in general, the ego would likes to blame and project outside of itself, because assuming any responsibility for any dysfunction or difficulty or challenge or whatever is happening in our lives that is just very uncomfortable on the spectrum, it's easier to project and blame others and say, well, your sex drive is low, or you don't like the things that I like, or it's not as important to you, so therefore there's something wrong with you. It's not that I want it too much, it's that, I want it too little. It's that you want it too much, or you want it too little. We do that, right? And ultimately, there's so many layers to sexuality, man. There's such vulnerability and rawness that comes with it. It can be so hurtful and painful for so many people. Not necessarily because they've been sexually abused. That's part of it, absolutely. And there's a high percentage of women and men that have been sexually abused or have experienced some form of sexual assault, which really cause inhibitions and retractions, right? And a numbness and a low sense of self-worth. And, when we feel violated, it's very, very difficult to deal with that. And so people spend years either suppressing that or avoiding it, or again, compensating for it. And it shows up in their sexuality. When you first get together with someone, there's such novelty, right? There's a hormonal flush that's moving through the body. It's called the Limerence Phase, or the honeymoon period. And we have we have blinders on. Like we always see is the good, and it's all about how amazing that person is. And the reality is that's not how it is, right? And so when that calms down and our physiology starts to change, anywhere generally from 6 to 18 months, but it can go longer than that as well, we then start to get a more whole perspective of the person. So our relationship to sex and sexuality changes, not for everyone, but for some, often one partner, not the other, or often both partners. And then they think, well, we were so sexually active in the first 2 years of our relationship. Now we're less sexually active. And no, it's not only the frequency or the quantity, it's also the quality has shifted. You're intertwining your lives more, whether it's financial, children, family, responsibilities. So your life is becoming full or more full with other things. And we tend not to prioritize ourselves. And plus it's waned a little bit, right? So the glow of novelty, that glow has, and variety has just come down now. And so it's easy to do that. And then it causes friction. But really what's happening is it's just pushing on old wounds that are unresolved. And it's not always related purely to sexual wounds. It could be, it's ultimately related to low self-worth. It's ultimately related to shame. Shame is the biggest one. I mean, really, I'll stop talking there and just say shame, because that's really what it is. And the layers of unconscious and conscious shame that we hold within us.
Now, talking about that, that early honeymoon stage and novelty and, long-term relationships, still finding this adventurous sexual energy to explore and try new things, right? And I can see where people run into that, because during the novelty phase, I always think of that as this exploration of you're both now figuring out how each other works and how your two machines work well together, which could be different than your previous partner's X, Y, and Z, just different energy. But as that continues forward, if I know what buttons push for her to get her to where she's trying to go, it tends to make more sense to try to push those buttons, right?
It also fills your self-esteem cup and your ego as well, right? That's what it does to us.
I'm pleased. Yeah, of course, right? I definitely know there's definitely different sexual energy. There's definitely some times where I want to do more of the giving and sometimes where I want to do more of the receiving, right? I guess what I'm getting at with sexual novelty over the long term in a relationship, because if I do figure out what works per se, and I look at that, for a metaphor to use the weight room, if I know squats get me stronger, I don't need to spend a bunch of time trying to figure out how lunges can replace squats. If we know this is what gets us off and that's what we're, getting toward, then why wouldn't we go that route?
Yep, I hear you. It's a very linear way of thinking, which is very masculine, right? No, it's not wrong. It's just not always going to work because we're such multifaceted beings. And it may work depending on people's preferences as well. And it may work if people are really attached to routine and continuity and habitual patterning, which we all have an element of it, but everyone's different. Everyone's risk tolerance is different. You see those guys sometimes. I don't see many women. It's mainly men, again, because of our testosterone largely and other societal factors. But you'll see these guys walking on fucking thin rails, 50 stories up, and then they go, oh, we fall. And then they grab one, and they've got one hand and they're hanging and they've got this camera here. And then your stomach sinks. And I'm like, I like to take risks. I've jumped out of a plane and shit before with a parachute, but fuck that. That's, everyone's risk tolerance is different. It's just like everyone's, routine, need for routine is different as well, right? And how routine makes people feel safe. Because often what it is routine is just helping people feel safe. So there's unconscious layers and tethers that come through. You don't just look at the behavior, look at what's underneath the behavior, look what's underneath that, look what's underneath that. Like it's an onion. Just keep allegorical, right? Just keep peeling back that shit.
Yeah, well, because that totally makes sense, right? That if I know this is what helps get her off or me get off, that makes me feel like a better lover.
Yeah, more of a man, better, more self-worth, all the things, right? And then look at where the pattern of satisfying others or pleasing others, where that's shown up in your life, where that originated in your life, what the inception of that is in your life, how that's become a pattern for you, and how you discovered that, I can do that really well sexually through sexuality, or I can do that really well through athletics, or I can do really well through friendships, or whatever it is. But what's at the core of that? That's not to say you're going to stop satisfying people or stop helping people feel good or wanting people to feel good. It's just that the come from is going to be a little different. The energetic's going to be different. And when the energetic's different and the intention's different, people feel that. It's called neuroception, through their own nervous system, through the unconsciousness of their nervous system, through their neuroception, they will feel your come from. Is your come from needy and desperate, or is your come from, from self-worth and confidence and elation and curiosity? They'll feel that in your nervous system. Again, contraction, expansion. That's what it is. Is the nervous system contracted or is it expanded?
Yeah. No, I like that. I like that. I think about, how that affects with the intention or expectations even going into those sexual encounters, right? I know, having the intention of, myself and my partner now being able to be like, we're going to be playing. There's a difference. If the expectation isn't just the orgasm, sexual gratification at the end of it, then there is a different aspect to why you're going into the act. And that, to me, opened up a lot of freedom. And I think a lot of people are reward based. And so it's like, we come, we got what we wanted out of it. We got the chemical spike. We got the connect. I'm a good lover. She's a good lover. We're both happy. We fall asleep, on to the next day. But you're not actually having this intimate connection with each other that's vulnerable and playing around and exploring each other and seeing what else is about.
Yeah. Yep. That's right.
Now, do you work with people trying to get out of that routine of like how to start implementing, I guess, a more adventurous personality into?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And that part of that is clearing any blocks they may have that they're not aware of, to allow the expression of that, clearing up the shame.
Yeah.
Moving and shifting the shame.
You had a quiz for love blocks.
Yeah.
I'll let you go into that a little bit. Like where, I guess, since you've been able to systematically break it down to have enough of a quiz to target it, what love blocks are people running into?
Yeah, that assessment is pretty comprehensive, actually. It's for an assessment, it's pretty comprehensive. So, fear of intimacy, fear of loss, fear of abandonment, fear of rejection, right? Like they're essentially, it's the quiz or the assessment is going to help you understand what are your fears that are blocking you from love, blocking you from experiencing yourself fully in another or in relationship. And usually it comes down to those 4 or 5 essentially. Fear of commitment is the fifth one.
That all makes sense.
Yeah.
Figuring out where those are, then figure out each other's safety and how to.
Yeah.
You going down this path and finding this side of your life, I mean, I feel a little weird not to ask, did any of this start with plant medicine? Did it?
No, it didn't start with plant medicine. And I have a very strong firm perspective on plant medicine. And I'm a massive advocate of plant medicine. And I have journeyed with plant medicine and sacrament many, many a time in my life, and will continue to do so. It's a beautiful medicine. It's a beautiful opener and consciousness expander. But it didn't start with me with that. It started with deep psychological and emotional and spiritual exploration in a familiar state of consciousness, which is, our everyday selves, right? Without taking myself to very unfamiliar states of consciousnness, right? Yeah. Although I have been there many a time and will continue to do so. With great reverence, though.
Yeah, it seemed to me that kind of once I had leaned into the self-discovery portion of it, that avenue opened itself up for me a lot with the plant medicine. And I know for sure that is something I'll have to be involved with the rest of my life.
Mm.
It's just been too shaping and too positive of an influence on me to be able to deal with my own bullshit well. I just didn't know if that, I guess probably wasn't the catalyst to get started in your path.
No, it wasn't the catalyst. No. However, it has been a catalyst, but it wasn't the catalyst, if that makes sense. Right. I started plant medicine quite late.
Okay. Yeah, I guess. Yeah, I did. I guess probably around like 30, 33, 34, somewhere around there.
Yeah, I was a little younger than that. I was early 30s. Yeah, like maybe 31, something like I'm 39 now. So yeah, I would say that quote unquote relatively late, like compared to.
It found me at a perfect time in my life.
Yeah, it will.
I don't know how you feel about hearing other stories from people, but when people talk to me about like they got into mushrooms or LSD in middle school or high school, I'm like, what the fuck are you even talking about?
I know. Yeah, kids in my school. I mean, kids were having sex when I was 11 years old, man, in my school. It was out of control. For me, it felt that way anyway. And then, kids were doing hard drugs and, 13, 14 years old. And I was like, whoa. And I never touched any of that. Marijuana, sure, but never any of those hard drugs.
No, and I grew up small town Louisiana in the South. And so we didn't run into a ton of, there was pot every once in a while, which I don't think I even saw till college. I'm going to be honest. But
yeah.
We're drinking and fucking, which seems to be pretty consistent for high school kids around the planet. I'm not sure how to end that one. I don't think we will. But I just find it fascinating. Then you also talk about like looking into other comforts, whether that's porn addiction or food or any of these other type of things to kind of mask over this insecurity. Is that just going back towards something that you feel you're in control of?
It's a need and a seeking to either control, right? control ourselves not feeling the feeling that we think's really big, or putting ourselves in an alternate reality. It's all about control, placing ourselves in an alternate reality where we don't have to face who we truly are, because we don't know who we truly are. We don't want to know. We're scared of knowing. We don't like who we are. We're scared of uncovering what's there. We can feel the trauma in our nervous systems, but we can't identify it. We don't even want to go and explore it.
Now, how do you define, I guess, the difference between healthy relationship with food, porn, sex to the addiction side?
Oh man, that's tough. So, one of the ways that we look at it is as, is it a reliance? Am I emotionally eating? Eating's a tough one for me personally. I love my food, and I can also use food as a crux to feel better about myself, right? Like emotionally. So it can be really tough. But if we have an over-reliance or a reliance to feel a particular way, and that thing, that object, that experience gives us that, and we can't regulate that ourselves, we're moving towards a compulsion or quote unquote addiction. We're trying to fill a void within ourselves. Right? Like if we're doing something and there's always going to be elements of that, like it's an exploration. But if the majority of that come from is, I need to fill this void, or I need to avoid something, or I'm not feeling good enough, so I'm going to take this thing or do this thing that helps me feel better, and I'm not going to deal with the source of that thing, that's a compulsion, that's an addiction, that's a over-reliance. So there's a subtlety there, but we have to take responsibility for how we see ourselves in that.
That makes sense. Dude, I can't thank you enough for your time. I come down to Allstone on a regular basis. I've been worked with on it for the last 4 or 5 years as one of their athletes. And so I'd love to hook up sometime, man. And
man, that's awesome. Do you know Andrew Craig?
I don't know that I do. Who's Andrew?
Okay. I thought, Andrew's one of their, Andrew's an ex-UFC fighter there, but he does a lot of he holds a lot of relationships with some of the athletes there. But
I do Paul and some other guys on their end, and then I've known Aubrey and Kyle now for
of course,
in that world anyway.
Yeah, man. Whenever you're here, let me know. Well, I was just at 10th Planet this morning training, and I was out on it last night. And but I've got my own gym in my garage as well, so you're more than welcome to come and hit it out.
Same here in St. Louis, gym, studio, all the same.
Awesome.
So, brother, I appreciate your time. And where can everyone find all your stuff if they're interested?
Yeah, thank you, man. So you can jump on my website, stefanosifandos.com, or coachwithsteph.com, and Instagram, social media at Stefanos Sifandos.
Yeah, dude, we'll put links to everything. And again, thanks for your time, brother. And I will see you soon. I'm sure next time I'm down that way.
Yes, sir. Appreciate you.
Thank you guys for listening, and we will talk to you next week.